Alright, cool. So we call this house to order on the motion that this house prefers a world without marriage. My name is Andrea and I'll be chairing this round. And our panel are Sneha, Rohan, Ellie, and Vicky. And we invite the Prime Minister to begin the debate for us.
Marriage is defined as a widespread bond between two individuals for life, for better or for worse, sharing property, wealth, emotional bonds in theory, what have you. But like all social constructs, marriage is informed by an informed society. It is a tool that is used by society. It takes on the characteristics and baggage of the context it's implemented in. And throughout history and today, the idea of bipersonal or multipersonal bondage for life is bad and it's very bad. We believe in an alternate world without this thing, people and society can be better actualized. So what kind of world do we support outside government? We are supporting a world where people start to actualize themselves using renewable contracts like business partnerships or maybe even cohabitation that needs to be renewed every single year. This is one option. But the core in their side is that there's no idea of permanence from life to death towards part. There has to be continual, evolving and repeated. So we believe this is a bright line which is reasonable. We are also very happy that states should confer benefits on children because they exist and not because of the marital status of their husband or their wife. Which really is very important. I've got three substantive arguments for you today as you expect. One, this divides society and hurts gay people. Number two, this hurts individuals. And number three, this harms families and children, while Robin will pull something out of his ass. This divides society because marriage at its core confers power on the state to decide what an in and out group is, pardon the pun. Here's the thing, we believe that arrangements about cohabitation should be defined and determined by different individuals and people, who are frankly speaking all different. We have different ideas of whether permanence is important, whether change is good for us, and ultimately, everyone is born with different needs, biological or spiritual or otherwise. So we do think that number one, a one-size-fits-all policy doesn't work. But further, we believe in preemption that even efforts to liberalize the definition of marriage leads to more in and out groups. For instance, the gay community distances themselves from people who want to practice incest and those who are polygamous because it doesn't suit them. At the core of the fight to liberalize marriage involves me saying it's not your idea. We have a lot of individuals thinking that they are right and seeking to impose it on everybody else, which we think at its core is a problem with the notion of a one-size-fits-all concept of permanence. We think in a world without marriage, people will approach social desires and contracts from the standpoint of the individual and what the individual matters the most, which cuts across all this societal bullshit that they have on their side, why we need to define ourselves as anywhere else other than who we are. Yes, Sadiq.
Why is it really the interest of the state to subsidize a fragile relationship which will most probably fracture in the long run?
Because at the point where you put so much pressure on people to get married before the age, but at the point where you put so much pressure on people to get married for housing bonds and flats, of course the marriage is going to be very fragile. I'll deal with that in my second point of contention, how your very definition of marriage makes it very fragile for individuals. But more on that later. My second substantive argument, Mr. Speaker, is how this hurts individuals in two main ways. This Part 2B will deal with Sadiq's POI. Part 2A deals with how this entrenches oppressive, regressive social roles. Here, Part 2.1 if you want. We think that the role of women is often seen in a very subjective and submissive manner. Like, I'm sorry, I'm Christian, but I'm not proud to say that throughout history, marriage has always been used by kings, by the churches, by the Catholic way, to impose roles on women as submissive. Because it is sacrosanct, because it is your God-given duty to be a submissive wife and mother. Here's the point. Even gay people have to self-define themselves by fighting for marriage, that the lexicon dictates that you're only worth as a community the moment you can find someone else to spend the rest of your life with. Yeah. Why is it the case that gay people should be forced to define themselves with their life partner? Why can't everyone look at it from an individual basis? At the point where people's right to actualize is being sinuously and surreptitiously encroached upon by this definition and narrative of what it means to be happy in life, we think a world without this would be a lot better. But secondly, on point 2.2, how this entrenches unhappiness and makes bad decisions. So, Sadiq's POI is this, that the state should have an incentive in subsidizing very fragile relations. Let's ask ourselves, why are relationships fragile? When people rush into things beforehand, fools rush in, every love song has been played on Class 75, whatever. Here's the thing, there's two ways. Either people often get married in the real world, not for love, but for benefits. social pressure, for example, that the state norms it as a duty to have children because Singapore's fertility rate is so freaking low, or even to get a housing subsidy to get a HDB flat. Like, that's awful. But more than that, even if you take these financial situations out of the equation of the state interest, we also see that when marriage is not as a virtue, individuals often get married to enjoy the sex. And then they go marry their first girlfriend and realize that I don't fit after all. I mean, really. I'm very Here's the thing. This artificial notion of holiness and virtue forces young people to make decisions they may and often do regret in the future because they believe it is their right before they believe they're ready. So for all these reasons, it harms individuals. But my third substantive argument deals with how it harms the very people it's supposed to protect, families and children. And here's where I give you Gender Studies 101. Historically, the way of raising families wasn't always within a marriage construct. There are things called the kibbutzim in Israel, like the kampos, you all know what those are. And even Hakka Samsui women were often regarded as nursemaids to children. Here's the thing, other modes of raising children and families did exist and were very prevalent throughout all of history. That worked. But the idea of permanent, by-person marriage has two harms on families very perversely. This is very crucial, listen up. Number one, it makes the notion clear that the people who are in the marriage contract have more responsibility than others in terms of taking care of the children. This ordinarily sounds okay, and most families would be okay with that. But for those which are on the margins and need help, it is now considered shameful to seek help from your relatives because you are irresponsible. It's considered very awful because you can't even hold your marriage together. What shame is used? The kind of stigma that comes with you having an unhappy marriage affects your ability to reach out when you do need the help. It doesn't also help that the current social discourse on the defense of marriage against gay people has trumpeted even in the most conservative Christian families that marriage ought to be between a man and a woman, therefore putting pressure on societies and communities to push marriage to people even before the kids are ready. So at the point this, it limits the family's ability to bring up the children. It makes the burden very onerous on these individuals, more so than any other. But for the matter, how it hurts children even more is that when they see that marriage is the only way forward, when they're struggling to come out of their identity, the kind of oppressive social norms conflate together religion to make it seem that they've got no other option or alternative in life, which you think is the worst kind of harm to visit upon children who deserve to have the most options possible. So what we think at the end of the day on SciGov is this, that all the benefits of marriage can be substitutable by other arrangements, by social contracts. But all the harms of marriage are very unique because of the core notion of two people or a little more in the notion of death do us part. The permanence which doesn't reflect a changing world, a permanence which is often too hijacked by the biggest in society when everyone should deserve to live their life free as a bird. We are very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for his speech. We now welcome the Leader of Opposition.
Entering into a relationship is more of a personal thing. It's your own self-actualization, right? So if it's your own self-actualization, each relationship differs. And we think that if individuals consent with one another and want to have that stability with one another, we think that the state should grant that option to marry. And we think that option should stand. And in a world without marriage, ladies and gentlemen, you are hampering self-actualization. You are hampering your idea of fulfilling social desires. Because if each individual defines relationships differently, who are you to decide that permanence is not how I would like to live my relationship by? That permanence or someone else defines me. It's not something that I would live by too, right? Because if someone can marry for money, if someone can marry for sex, and then I can definitely marry one person in my entire life, and I will see that person when I go to heaven or hell too, right? Depending on how I behave, right? So before I move on to my points of argumentation, number one, marriage as a concept, is it good? 4 levels under that. And secondly, why cohabitation necessarily is bad? Because if you notice, it was more of marriage bashing rather than actually a comparison of how cohabitation would make things better. We didn't see that. Let's go to the first point, right? On the idea of the model. Because apparently there's a renewal of contracts. Because so that number one, we're against the idea of permanence. And number two, so that we can continue the idea of social desires. I don't see how that's a difference with marriage per se. Because marriage is also still a contract. Number two, how's that any different than a divorce? If a person does have any problem with you, right, and you don't like that person, and you can't prove it in court, you can't divorce that person. So permanence is not necessarily permanent. Oh, you know what? A person dies. Oh, hey, I can marry somebody else too. Lucky me, right? Sit down. In any instance, if that person does not fulfill my social desires, hey, we got something called a prenup, right? Like a lot of movie stars, a lot of rich people have that too. They put it in their closets, and as long as both parties consent, if you gain above a certain weight, by the time you're 50, I will definitely dissolve you. If our sex life deteriorates, my dear lovely wife, husband, whoever you are, then if our sex life does deteriorate, then this is something that you have to fulfill within those contracts. And that's something that can be negotiated by two parties, and these avenues already exist. Why? To protect your self-actualization, to protect your happiness, to protect whatever you want to fit into, right? So we think that these are the kinds of avenues that states provide already. No harm to society whatsoever. Let's go to another problem according to them. Because now there's societal pressure. Number one, yeah, there's pressure to get jobs too, but we don't ban people from getting jobs. Because why? The value of marriage in itself is good because it does protect individuals. And sit down. Under those instances, right, if you want to talk about familial pressure, we still see individuals breaking out of that because they already realize what they want within a relationship under those instances, right? But under your proposal, pressure can still exist because there will still be pressure for you to find your other person, whether or not you marry that person or not, because you are still cohabiting. You are still cohabiting, right? So there is still pressure for you to have kids just out of wedlock. It's still pressure for you to find someone else, just not on legal paper or probably a paper every 5 years. So tell me, how is no pressure then existing under your model? Because apparently pressure only exists in marriage. Then they said, oh, it's a regressive role on women, but you're supporting renewal contracts too, right? I mean, like, how is that not regressive towards women? Even worse, you have to renew that contract, right? You only as good to me every 5 years if I deem you fit, as compared to just a contract. How is that protection on both sides? But we see marriage has also evolved. When you have a marriage between two women, who's the regressive one there, right? I mean, especially when it's a homosexual relationship. But we still, in these instances, they said there's an inability for you to define yourself with your life partner. Says who? You can define yourselves with your life partner, especially if that partner is the same, has the same goals, the same identities towards you, right? You cannot say that the only thing that needs to be defined, you cannot say that everyone has to be defined by their life partner. They have to define it themselves. They say make decisions that are damaging and make decisions when they're not supposed to. I don't see how this actually would exist. What kind of decisions that you would make that you will not necessarily do if you were in a marriage, right? So we don't think that those kinds of decisions or damages would necessarily exist. Before I move on, anyway.
Yeah, the difference is there is no default expectation that people should get married, which means that without expectations, people's abhorrent reaction to breaking that expectation is much lower or non-existent.
But there's still expectation for yours as well, because yours is just a contract that's just temporary, right? Because your main contention was permanence, not necessarily having that relationship with somebody. Because what's your contention? Your contention is relationship, right? There can still be pressure because you need to form a relationship. The contention here is this, whether that relationship needs to be defined or not. That's something they didn't do in today's debate, right? So let's go to the first point of argumentation. Marriage as a concept is good, because we still think that marriage is a highest form of representation of a bond between two individuals. A representation that's not only recognized by the state, but by virtue of that recognized by society. Why do you think that homosexuals or the African Americans want to marry, want to champion the idea of marriages? Because they realize that once I do get married, it's also a form of acceptance by everyone else that I can have a relationship with that person. When they finally released the prohibition of interracial marriages, that was a huge leap. Or the same thing, prohibition of between blacks, that now they can marry too. It's also a sign. It's a form of social engineering and acceptance that I recognize your relationship in the form and which will lead to self-actualization and your own happiness. So we think that it does fulfill the purposes of that. Sit down. But what we also tell you, right, is also self-actualization of individuals on a few other levels. Number one, on legacies and name. Individuals would like to prioritize their legacies and inheritance laws, for example, to continue that the family lineage is protected, because that's something that's important to them, and that's something that's given with each and every individual, especially when you have contracts. Third thing, especially when talking about security and legality, individuals need to have that form of security, especially when talking about raising and having children, right? And within these instances, especially talking about things like in times of need, when it comes to healthcare and property, individuals that, especially when it comes to children, when you have emotions, so that you can provide emotional security towards his children and protection, especially when you're talking, for example, if the child, for example, parents, no, that's not the right example. So when it comes to security, right? Because when you fact that you are going to form a long-term relationship bond with that individual. That's why the state grants you rights for your family and for your institution, because they know that you are not going to leave that person in any space or time. Why is it bad if you just had a world of cohabitation? The idea of instability would exist because there are very few individuals who can completely trust their other partner and they completely trust that they're stable and they will not leave them. Not everyone is like that. Not everyone has that partner. Giving individuals emotional stability and physical stability by these marriages is a good benefit. They've never proven in this debate that how cohabitation would work. With that, we're very proud to win this game.
Guys, if you're coming in, please come in.
I'm just delivering.
Are we okay? Cool. Alright. So we thank the speaker for his speech. We now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Ladies, gentlemen, man horse, the key thing what that side is, why exactly is it that all the benefits they talked about, security, permanence, social recognition, although that's a bit dodgy, why can't they be achieved in the absence of a sanctified social institution, where either a priest or the state has the right to tell you, you are now an in-group. You are now the basic building blocks of society, in contrast to everybody else. Why exactly do you require such an institution for love, for security, for legacy to be secured, when it can be secured elsewhere? Conversely, they never dealt with the idea that there are other harms that are exclusive to marriage. The pressure you impose on individuals, the expectation of virtue that stems directly from the historical and cultural baggage that stems from marriage. Because marriage cannot solely be seen as the idealized Western version of marriage. In the real world, marriage must be seen in the context of the cultures they come from and the cultures they seek to entrench. With that in mind, I'm going to look at a few rebuttals because before I'm going to talk about an expert topic of mine, love. But before that, if people consent to it, we should not ban it. Clearly, this is not a policy debate. We're not going to ban it. It's a value judgment debate that stated that historically the institution of marriage had never existed, the world would be a better place. The second, more important issue is what people can still divorce. There is still an escape clause. The problem is that throughout the entire annals of human history, divorce is incredibly difficult. Even now, throughout most of the world, you may live in the First World War, throughout most of the world, no fault divorce is the exception rather than the rule. But more than that, there's a pressure to say that once you're over 50, divorce is not an option. You must stay within a marriage because it's better. Because once you get out, you're less worthy of a person. You're no longer worthy of the sacrifice status that marriage already gives you. So insofar as they acknowledge that the exit clause must exist, the sanctity and the subsidization of marriage makes the exit clause worse. Next, pressure will exist anyway. What's the problem with that? The first is that they have an onus to show. Since they agree that the pressure and the rush towards marriage and social marriage necessarily exists, they must show that this pressure is a good thing. They must show this pressure to push people towards marriage, either early or to see marriage as the basic building blocks of society is necessarily beneficial for society. They can't just say that a marriage will exist anyway. They claim that this pressure will exist even within our alternative paradigm. And we agree. The difference here is that the marriage is not bound up in virtue. It's not bound up in the idea that if you get married, you are now an in-group within that particular society. It is not conferred upon you by a priest or the state. They do not give you flats or money or tax breaks in order to ensure that this particular pressure exists. Nobody can say that because you enter into this, you are thus more worthy of a person. Social pressures are a lot more easy to ensure than all these cultural and state-led pressures. But more than that, we think oftentimes this pressure precisely leads to a one-size-fits-all phenomenon where individuals never ever explore what other kinds of lifestyle is necessarily the best life arrangement for them. Why can't platonic friendships raise kids? I know Alfred and Pratik would like to do that. They're never ever likely to explore it. Alfred is more likely to go to the next secondary school and find his moving on to the substantive. First, that permanence and security are a good thing. My first rebuttal is what I said in my introduction. People can still choose to stay together. They can choose to have a contract to renew every year, or they can choose not to have a contract and stay together for 30 and 30 years of their life. Essentially, that's what a lot of gay couples have been doing in countries where marriage is already, gay marriage is already there. So all those benefits, even if they are not subsidized, can still be ensured. But the problem here is that our policy facilitates it. If they think that upon marriage, after 30 years, necessarily their marriage has lost its flavor, necessarily their marriage no longer suits them, and they want to explore other things, there is none of the state-led social oppression that makes that barrier so difficult to take down. But more than that, here they've now grappled with what Lucas said. That is precisely that marriage is supposed to be permanent, and divorce is the exception rather than the rule. That the regressive behavior inherent to marriage becomes more entrenched, because marriage is seen as so sacred that nobody can ever interfere. So a polygamous marriage, an abusive marriage, for instance, is seen as something authorities, society can never ever interfere in. That is why you can be a feminist in every area of your life, but somehow when you are in a marriage, you submit to your husband, you act like Raihana, you are never ever condemned. We think the problem with that is exactly that you mean that progress within relationships can never be ensured. Go.
Within the marriage institution itself, there are different values, and those values are still being challenged. Aren't you just taking the extreme context of marriage?
The problem with these values being challenged is precisely that people seek to imbue value into marriage to begin with and impose it on other people, which brings me to the next idea, social recognition. They claim that this is acts as a way to socially recognize outgroups. That's precisely the problem. That outgroups like homosexuals must seek the consent of straight people to show that their relationship is somehow over. And they must somehow beg the state, or beg certain high priest, or beg a bishop to say that our relationship is as worthy as the next person. That is precisely why marriage is often seen as a way for groups to exclude other groups. That's why what Lucas says is very important. Even when homosexual men gain the right to get married, one thing they always say is that we're different from polygamous couples. We're different from incestuous couples. Even though those people may potentially love themselves as well. Anytime even out-groups become in-groups, they seek to keep other people out to maintain and verify their particular status. That is precisely the problem of marriage. So you may be able to liberalize marriage to a certain extent, but it will forever be a tool of exclusion and we think that's harmful. Moving on to my substantive, how this denigrates love. Now, all of us have heard that story, right? When a good friend of mine, a parent, whose father told the mom, let's get a flat, and that's how they got married. The problem here precisely is that they agree that privileges should be entrenched, should be linked to marriage. They should subsidize, give tax breaks, and see marriage as a more desirable social institution. The first problem with this is that people often get married not because of love. They get married because they've already paid for dinner and there's lots of shark's fins and abalone to be eaten. They always get married because the tax break and the chance that they could potentially get a flat ahead of other people. From countries all the way from Norway to Singapore, couples are encouraged to get married in order to act as soldiers to solve the population deficit problem. That derogates one of the core purposes of marriage, which is love. But more than that, we think oftentimes it is difficult to tell if love is the core reason that people get married to begin with, because there is such social obligation from parents, from the state, from religious preachers, from everybody else. We would rather the social preachers never exist. It is from there that the epistemology and the lexicon that your clock's ticking, that I'm sure you'll find someone someday, that there's someone out there for everyone, somehow becomes received with wisdom. Somehow becomes the idea that you must find that special someone, otherwise you're going to be alone. That there's no alternative mode of arrangement, that you can never ever actualize yourself in. Insofar as certain people may find that counterpoint, they must always define themselves in opposition to marriage. That is precisely the problem. So if we want to be in love and stay together, our world allows for that too. But their world imposes deleterious harms on the ability to self-actualize and the ability of any group to feel included in society. And for those reasons, I'm immensely proud of folks.
Thank the speaker for his speech. We now welcome the Deputy Leader.
The point where the institution of marriage has persisted for millennia is a direct and explicit indicator that there's currently a utility tied to it. We need to recognize one thing in this debate, that different people have different conceptions of happiness and how they would like to affiliate themselves to those conceptions of happiness. The unique part about entering a marital institution is that it's a public declaration that you will be with your spouse for the rest of your life, and you'll be guarded under that sanctimonious religious or a-religious institution as you define yourself to be. If I want to treat my wife as a unique person, which is different in just the same way I treat Mubarak and Arina differently, an institution of marriage enshrines that level of exclusivity because it institutionalizes my relationship in contrast to relationships of other kinds. 3 questions must be answered in my speech. The first question, does marriage divide society? There are 2 subpoints here. The first subpoint brought up by that side is that marriage, that happiness is something which is subjective. First response, we agree. In just the same way how different people might actually see cohabitation as a means for them to express their happiness, we think there are a substantial amount of people who would like to maintain the exclusive status of marriage to ensure that their wife will stay with them and also so that their husband will stay with them. That definition of exclusivity is the actualizer of my happiness, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, we think the unique part about marriage in amplifying the concept of happiness is that it institutionalizes my relationship, because now it is a relationship with my unique spouse in contrast to a normal relationship or one-night stand or with my friend. Therefore, there's a clear difference here, because this is an exclusive relationship. Because before you get married, families must meet with one another, you need to sign a legal contract, and all these kind of procedures clearly differentiate you from a normal relationship. So we think happiness can be maximized under our policy. The next thing we should say under this sub-point was that, now societal pressure is something which is really strong. Untrue. Why is it so? Because before, marriage is not a rash decision, right? Often there will be tremendous family discussions where family will scrutinize every single part of a marital institution. But more importantly, you will also discuss with your brothers and sisters and your friends whether that's the right partner or not. Because you do realize that this will not be a rash decision, because in a vast majority of cases, you'll be spending the rest of your life with that person, ladies and gentlemen. But let's flip the question on them. We think pressure under your policy will be made far worse. Because if it's only a temporary business contract, that's when your family members will say, let's just go try that person. And if you fail, you can exit from that business contract with the least amount of consequences. We think societal pressure will be made far worse under your policy in contrast to ours. Second, which policy protects minorities? We think our policy does this. Why is it so? Firstly, they missed Arina's argument, right? Let's recognize one thing. In the past, a lot of relationships were seen as a taboo. Specifically, if you look at homosexual relationship, the rhetoric of the West Baptist Church is that to deny them from entering the institution of marriage is that often they only want one-night stand and also they are unfaithful person. And our policy, if they're able to marry a person that enshrines their level of unity and love upon a person, and not only treating them as a person or an object of a one-night stand to a point and enshrines that they are unfaithful figures. We think this is something which is important. But secondly, marriage is a public declaration where the state accepts you for who you are, and it's a societal recognition on that point, in contrast to you being labeled as a person who's unfaithful. We think we protect them. But second sub-point here, they want to say, but now, you will need to submit towards your husband. Therefore, often you'll be treated like Rihanna. We think even if that's the case, we think it's better on our policy. Why? Because if cases of abuses happen, there are legal protection which marriages would necessarily entail. Therefore, often you can take civil suits against your husband. More importantly, the money which you will get will significantly increase. In contrast, if a normal person beats me up, in contrast, if my wife beats me up, although that's highly unlikely. In this regard, under our policy, legal protection will be far better if you fall within the institution of a marriage in this regard. Sit down. So what's the conclusion here? We think this is a fair platform. We think this is just. The third question which I need to answer is the conception of stigma. Because they said now if you fall under an unhappy marriage, therefore you'll be stigmatized for life. That's untrue. How does society perceive this, right? Society sees that if you are under an institution of marriage, they see that there's still a possibility that the marriage will persist. There's still a chance for you to negotiate with one another. If you're only under a business contract, there's an easy cop-out, ladies and gentlemen. You can easily run away from the problem in contrast to solving the problem internally. But finally, it's Robin's argument about, sometimes people don't marry about love. Sometimes they marry because of state benefits. Well, under status quo, under your policy, people might cohabitate with a rich guy, because maybe the rich guy is generally rich, and I think that's fine. But under your policy, you agreed that you are okay with extending states' benefits in that regard. But more importantly, we think that's a legitimate choice. Some people might marry for love, some people might marry for money. We think that's perfectly legitimate. We're fine with that. Yes.
How is it right that you're able to enshrine your conception of a right relationship and say it is superior to promiscuity, to a one-night stand, or to a platonic friendship?
I know you under status quo in our policy, we provide a variety of options for people to choose. What we're saying is that the access towards a religious conception of marriage or an irreligious conception of marriage should be continued. My argumentation, first, security in relationships. We specifically would like to talk about adulterers. 2 points here. Firstly, how will this deter wife stealers from fracturing that familial institution? Number one, because of the very conception of the stigma which we would like to talk about. Because if you choose to cheat, that means societal stigma will be maximized. Secondly, there are laws protecting you, like laws against enticement. Laws means that you can be sued in the court of law, or laws which also means that the transfer of property will be given to your wife. Thirdly, you are morally deterred from doing so. Because you know, once a person is within an institution of marriage, it's so important that that person genuinely loves one another, in contrast to the person who's merely a boyfriend and a girlfriend. Therefore, I would be deterred to even act out of it. What's the conclusion and why is this really important? Number one, it grants emotional protection towards the spouse, ladies and gentlemen. And we do recognize, right? Maybe some spouses generally are very cautious and they are uncertain, especially if this is a new relationship. We think it's perfectly legitimate for the spouse to be emotionally secured in this regard. But secondly, we also protect the livelihood of children. And this is something which they missed out. Because this means that this provides emotional security for children, because marriage symbolizes a long-living relationship. And we think that's also something which is important. But secondly, it grants a declaration of exclusivity to children that my dad and mom will most likely stay together, in contrast having new dads and new moms every day, the very conception which they want, which is really, really weird. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, something which I missed out in this debate is the very experience which I get from family unity and the kind of celebration of marriages which will only exist under policy. Because everyone in this room, if I can, will invite you to my marriage, and the level of collective happiness which I can get through that public declaration is something which we want, something which enshrine and the institution of marriage. For all those reasons, I'm extremely happy to oppose.
We now welcome the government whip.
Allow opposition side to falsely compare marriages and status quo, because the context by which they are operating in does not actually exist. The first issue I want to resolve is where are individuals really better off and freer to make the decisions that are congruent for their happiness, be it to have multiple relationships or to have one relationship, to have no relationships at all, to love men and to love women and to love both of them at the same time, right? Arena's contention, continued by Sadiq, is that our model is exactly the same as theirs, where societal pressures are just as encoded and individuals will just be as pressured. Let's look at it and ask the question, how is marriage actually encoded right now in status quo? It begins with Sadiq's POI to Lucas, where he does admit that the government endorses it through tax breaks and providing you exclusive benefits only if you are married. It is also told to you by Lucas in his substantive material by telling you that society in general already expects it from you. Even parents, for example, because under their model they were married and they had a child, will already tell you that that's how it's going to happen. We also told you that religions prescribe this. That means that 3 of the biggest moral influences in your life as you are growing up and being socialized under their model are telling you that the default is at the end of your life there will always be someone who is for you, and most likely that someone will be only from the opposite gender. Vis-a-vis our model, where you can walk in and out of relationships when you want to, where you can choose contracts if you want them or not, where states don't provide benefits so there is no endorsement, and churches won't tell you if you divorce, you will go to hell. How is that similar at all influences in your life do not have a default expectation and do not have a default prescription, that is not the same. The second cop-out that they had is to say, but look, even if societal pressures exist under the model, there is divorce. Robin already told you how most of the time that is inaccessible. But even assuming that it is always going to be accessible, right? Just because you can get out of that particular difficulty does not mean that the difficulty that you experience staying in that relationship and trying to make something work does not mean that it is already okay that you went through that. At the end of the day, that does not discount the suffering that individuals experience because you are forcing them to stay in a relationship that from the very beginning was doomed to fail. But Sadiq suddenly says that, but look, the absence of societal pressure is essentially going to exist. Even assuming that that is true, costs at least in our, that Sadiq says that societal pressure will exist under our side because essentially you're only going to stay together for quite some time, right? So people will keep pushing you. It's only temporary, you better go and try it out. That's okay, because if people try it out in our model, the costs are very little. It could be 1 year, it could be 2 days, it could be 1 week. In your model, it's forever, right? And if it's not forever, it's the forever jarring judgment that you underwent divorce and you've undergone it 5 times under their model. So no, the costs, at least, even if they occur in our model, are much less. But the third thing, and the third reason that we need to, their response to this issue, is we need to deconstruct Arena's substantive. Why she even wants people to be able to declare that people are meaningful to them, or in Sadiq's words, are, put them in a pedestal because they are unique. Robin already told you that is that really still true in status quo, the way marriage has evolved and has been endorsed and encoded? Because while people put it as a sacrosanct thing, can we really tell who is doing it for the sacrosanct reason of love, or people who are doing it simply to accrue the benefits that their states have endorsed to them? Can we really tell, for example, that people are doing it because their spouse is unique, or they're simply doing it because flats are really expensive in Singapore, or because divorce is illegal in the Philippines, or because separation is very difficult and shameful in the Chinese culture, or it can even get you killed in India and some other religions? We don't think so. That's why we think that even the expression of love under their model, where people will want to be able to express it, is not necessarily to its fullest extent. Vis-a-vis our model, where if people get to renew contracts every year and they do that for the rest of their lives, then you know that's worth something, right? Where if people get to stay together forever, even if the default expectation is that it's not, it's a lot more admirable because people really did find that concept of permanence that they want. The only difference is people who want to be single or people who want to keep on passing relationships will be more present under our model. Before I proceed, sure.
Look, you're being selective. It's bad because Chinese people say divorces are bad. But why would they still put the same pressure on you to cohabitate?
Huh? Of course they're going to put the same pressure for you to cohabitate, because if divorce is bad, they want you to stay together, right? Obviously, individuals want to put the pressure for you to be permanent. Vis-a-vis our model, if the marriage is not the default expectation, then there is no necessity for you to put that pressure on individuals to stay together and cohabitate forever. But then here's the second issue. What is really better or worse off for subjugated groups? Because Sadiq says under that point that, it's really weird if you're going to have new moms and dads every day. I know, right? So most likely people will not do that, right? Most likely you're going to be raising children in communities when at the point in time marriage still did not exist. That is a more likely scenario to exist and to actually be more believable, because if individuals do understand that being able to raise children as a group is more viable, that's more likely to exist. But second of all, we think that even if at the extreme we provide credence to that very ridiculous argument that people will have new moms and dads every now and then, how is that any worse off than parents who are staying together for the sake of it right now in status quo, allowing their children to suffer through arguments every single day, allowing them to believe that these individuals and that you are the burden of the family simply because they cannot escape and actualize themselves because, oh, by accident, you already exist. Sorry, child, I don't understand how that's any better. But the last ridiculous thing that they said, it's not better for subjugated groups because apparently you can only have legal protection from abuses if you're married. I'm unsure about this, but I think you can sue someone for assault and for beating you up whether or not you're married, right? If they rape you, even when you're married or outside of that marriage, you can also sue them. But if you look at it, it's also a bit more difficult to sue someone if they rape you when you are in that particular marriage. So I don't know how that whole legal protection thing works for you. But what they never responded to is this very strong laid out idea, both from Lucas and Robin, talking to you about in and out groups, where you want to talk about women and gays, for example, who have always been sidelined in the history of relationships and individuals because they have always believed that these individuals are outside of what is the default expectation. True, marriage can probably adjust to them one day the way we are trying to include the gays. But there is always a limit to how much marriage can adjust, because if everyone who has different conception of how relationships should be is trying to encode all their different conceptions in the same system, there is no way to reconcile very polar conceptions. The only way that can happen is if there is no system entrenching it, there is no system encoding it, and that is why this system is much better. Affirmative clearly takes this debate. Thank you.
If side proposition were to be believed, the removal of marriage would automatically mean that everyone was liberal. Everyone would say, oh, you don't need to stay on those contracts anymore, let's leave your children there. Under their model, they think that cultural and religious views are tied to marriage. They are not. The idea of promiscuity will still be demonized by culture, by society, even if you remove marriage from that. With that in mind, three questions in this debate. First, do our gender roles and subjugation of women and all those things really tied to marriage, or is that more cultural than that institution? Number two, acceptance and recognition. Do we think it is important for those individuals, and whether or not, why we think, therefore, it is an inherent good for society to have people who can self-actualize by that first minute? Third, I'll talk to you about the idea of permanent decisions, why we think permanent decisions should still be allowed, even if that makes some people regret them. So first, ladies and gentlemen, why do we think that, look, if you understand this, right, because they can't get the best of both worlds. You can't say, oh, all of a sudden we'll have one-year contracts and people will be very different all of a sudden. No. As Valerie already considered in her speech, once you have children, you will automatically, societal pressure will exist for you to continue to cohabitate. They have a system where you have easy opt-out systems to begin with. If you really want to talk about pressure societies that pressurize you to begin with. Sit. Second, ladies and gentlemen, therefore, we don't think people will be able to explore those lifestyles that they think will happen, right? Because we don't think marriage ties it up. We don't think marriage is the one that entrenches division. Rather, do you really think that if you remove marriage, all of a sudden, bearded men who want Sharia law will go and say, here come my gay brothers, let's hug? No. That's exactly the problem, right? Marriage is not something that is causing that problem, right? Because it is something that these people will do anyway to begin with. So we think that societal pressure means societal pressure will still exist under their model, and we don't think that the benefits they want to get will come anyway because the same kind of societal pressure will exist. However, what they won't get, and this is what I move on to my second idea, is that acceptance and recognition. Because when we talk about marriage being used as a tool for telling people that, you know what, interracial marriage should happen, or gay, homosexual marriage should happen, it is a tool to preach tolerance towards individuals within society. And that is something that they haven't attacked. But second, right, because individuals, we agree, individuals are different. And this is why some individuals need that idea that I am permanently with my wife in order to be able to achieve that level of sense of security by himself. And that is why that happiness is important for those individuals, as opposed to one-year contracts where they don't have it. But we think also that women are much more likely to be treated as objects under their model, because right now, when some men are told, hey, you can just go and experiment, 1 or 2 years down the line, those women, when their guys don't renew their contracts to begin with, those women will be even more ostracized by society, because they're the ones left out right now. I think that's more harmful to those women when you say that, you know, we promote these experimentations in conservative societies. We think, secondly, right, we also provide emotional protection for these individuals, because not only does this have security of permanency, obviously we're not going to protect laws that say rapes within marriage are good, right? We obviously have laws against that as well. But we also have laws which means that emotional protection is there. So as opposed to a random person beating someone else, you have more punishment for individuals who you trust who then beat you. This means if a husband beats you, this means the court will provide special protection for you. This means emotional protection is provided for individuals within the institution of marriage as well, right? We also talk about cheaters, right? People who cheat on their marriage partners to begin with. And in those instances, these people get priority over children custody, etc. These are things that provide protection for these individuals through the institution of marriage, right? Lastly, we think that protection of children is also very important, right? Because it's not the same. Rooney's contract is expiring. He might leave Manchester United. You don't want children to think along those lines of their fathers, right? Oh, the contract is expiring. Will my father renew it? We think this idea should be there, right? A child must not feel insecure every time their parent have a fight between them. That kind of moral solace should be given upon those children, especially if those parents want to give it to those children to begin with. Yes.
Have you ever talked to a divorced parent's child who feels insecure every single moment of his waking life because parents cannot decide what the fuck to do with themselves?
That happens under your model when people simply go and say, oh, I experimented, I didn't like that, let's leave. But that happens under your model. We think the idea that people are at least committed to a permanent relationship increases that chance of child feeling solace and feeling more secure. But lastly, right, this is the initial idea that they put, that you know what, people can sometimes feel pressurized and regret decisions because a permanent decision is an irreversible decision. We say, so what? People, yes, they can make mistakes. But the idea that they can make permanent decisions should still be there. We still allow people to have sex change operations because that is how they feel they must self-actualize, right? If that's how people feel, we think that is something the society should be able to condone and then therefore support that, right? We think if people want to have a permanent decision, because people, if they feel that a permanent decision is what's best for them, what's wrong with it to begin with, right? But we also think that when people make permanent decisions, that is when they are much more likely not to make those decisions on material benefits. Under their model, it is much more likely that those individuals will make it for financial benefit, etc. When they are much more likely to be temporary to begin with, last minute. We also think that therefore, under our model, when individuals make those decisions, that they know that this is the person they're going to have children with, this is the person they're committing to for life, that is when these institutions are much more likely to be sacred, to be pure. What have we shown you here? We've shown you that, look, it's a blatant lie that marriage is causing divisions. We think it's cultural. It's not something that will go away under their model. In fact, it will make things worse when women will be held hostage by their husbands to be threatened. You know what? I'll just leave you after the contract expires, etc. We think that's the kind of things that will happen. We provide protection for children who have security in having parents who they think will be permanent. We have people who have the solace of knowing that their partners are there for their life, right? We at least provide emotional protection for these individuals from being beaten by their spouses, from making sure that if their partners cheat, for instance, they will get protection and custody of their children to begin with. We also think, ladies and gentlemen, that people do have the ability to make permanent decisions, even if that means sometimes they regret it. It's much worse under their model, where you treat women like objects, where you say, you know what, I can simply leave you whenever I want. We oppose that. We are proud to oppose.
It is sad to know that in government's reality, the person who I genuinely love, a person who I do not only treat as a friend or even as a best friend, a person who I put on a different pedestal will be treated as equals as every one of you in this room. But more importantly, the contract, which to me is a contract of permanence, would automatically be destroyed to be seen as a contract of impermanence. 3 questions must be answered in this debate. Which policy maximizes happiness? Secondly, which policy best assists children? And finally, even if it's hard to opt out from a marital institution, why that value is something which is good in this debate. To the first, which policy maximizes happiness? We told you often, to a substantial amount of individuals, happiness is always premised upon the element of exclusivity. We gave you the nitty-gritty details of the different kinds of systems and procedures which you need to go through in order for you to get married, in contrast if you want to make friends with another person. Their response was, but no, you will weaken this value because you don't know what will happen. Often, sometimes they just want to become an exclusive couple because of money. Number one, in my speech already told you, who are you to make that prejudgment on behalf of that person? Especially when there's a substantial amount of people within our society who won't marry on the basis of money. But sadly, that argument will hurt you as well, because people do cohabitate with a rich guy, right? And that came from my speech. But Mubarak went further. Under your policy, it will be far worse, because under policy, if marriage is something which is permanent and sin which is something which is permanent, the element of exploitation based on money would automatically be reduced. And we think there's a cogent response from our side. But the second sub-point here, we told you that in our policy, marriage creates a public declaration of happiness, i.e. collective happiness, because this is different than other forms of relationships. You need to take extra time. You need to meet with family members, and all those kinds of procedures, signing the contracts and all these kind of things, means that societal level of celebration will increase tremendously. This came in my speech, ignored by government whip, because that's when people know that the way how I treat you as a married couple is different than the way how I treat you as merely as girlfriends and boyfriends. So we think that kind of collective happiness is a value which we fight for. But third is on the element of security in relationships, because whether we like it or not, there are people who feel insecure. Maybe they just don't look that good, therefore they feel insecure knowing that their wife might leave them. And our policy, the institution of marriage, will provide the emotional barrier and guard for that person, because if you choose to leave, you'll be stigmatized. If you choose, but more importantly, there will be laws against enticement, and those like if you divorce, transfer of property will be given upon the person who was cheated upon. What value do we get? We get emotional protection for the person who loses out. Second, legal protection in this regards, right? The very minority groups we like to protect will best be protected under the policy, because if that person gets cheated with another person, therefore you can sue the person, and under your policy this cannot happen at all. So we think that regard is better under our policy. But finally, again, something you missed out is the value in keeping your name and heritage. That the Kennedys, and this is something you should put forth even in Arina's speech, something should missed out from that side. Second, on children. This is a funny conception from that side, right? Because they think that, it's good to put the children's life on a track, knowing that maybe after 2 or 3 years, my dad will leave me and have a new dad. And maybe in the next year, my another dad will come up. Often children want security. And marriage, which is seen as a long-lasting relationship, will provide that form of emotional insurance. We do recognize it's hard for you to opt out from a marriage. Therefore, it becomes an informed decision when you opt out from a marriage. Therefore, we think it is at times there is a value for it to be hard to opt out from a marriage. Because once you choose to opt out, clearly means that you take everything into consideration, in contrast just when your business contract expires. Where have we reached so far in this debate? We need to recognize one thing: a substantial portion of society places a high premium on the exclusive nature of relationship. We think those individuals deserve the right to access that form of relationship. Often it's not pressure upon societal perception, especially since it's seen as a life-changing decision. A person will be locked into a life for the rest of your life, or that perception is something which is there. We think that's good. We think that's beneficial.
Now welcome the governor.
Let's start with the issue of how the institution of marriage informs consent, because that's the basis of this entire debate. They very glibly, especially in the third speaker, say that regressive modes of forcing people into marriage, of imposing a one-size-fits-all system and saying those who are outside the system are necessarily less virtuous, will happen anyway. First, in Lucas's speech, we've already shown you that this culture has been created and crafted by marriage to begin with, when governments and priests, in the long run, were able to pressure people. But second, if they agree that such regressive worldviews are necessarily a bad thing, why is it right that the most powerful institutions in a society are able to impose this permanently on individuals? That is the question they never answered. Well, let's say, we can say each other out here, in both our policies, this harms could potentially exist. The difference here, and this is something well talked about, in their world, if these individuals negotiate a bad marriage contract once, chances are they're fucked for the rest of their life, especially if they come from a state without no-fault divorce, especially if they come from a state where the social pressure against divorce is immense. In our world, at a minimum, with temporary contracts or preferably no contracts at all, people can still exit. They can do it if they can do it the moment they know that the contract is bad. And it's endemic of the sexism and misogyny in that team that they assume that only men can abuse this, that only men can make use of this to get rid of women. We posit that women can get rid of this if they're unhappy in a marriage too. That is something they've never talked about. But next, this idea of social exclusion becomes very important. This is where they really lost the debate. They say social exclusion is necessarily ameliorated because marriage acts as a way to welcome people. Here, they've never dealt with what I and Lucas said, that throughout the entire annals of human history, that has not happened. But more than that, once out-groups get access into in-groups, they then try to exclude other people. And that is precisely our problem. It is great that in a few states in the world today, gay marriage is possible. In most of history, that was not possible. And for the remainder of human history, even gays will start excluding other people. That is harm we talked about. From the beginning, never engaged by the side of the house. So what then was the value that they tried to promote through marriage? The biggest one is security and love, which then must be enshrined and pedestalized in opposition to relationships that are not pure, like one-night stands, like promiscuity, like adulterers. And that is precisely the problem. Why it is okay if you want to pedestalize your partner within the privacy of your relationship. But why is it that you must get the state, you must get all the religions, you must get the ability of the hereafter to enshrine the marriage in the public sphere? That is something we talked about right from Lucas. That is the insidious pressure that is imposed on every human being in society. So it is sad that individuals may feel less secure about their love because society and the church doesn't endorse it. Or we think the price of not excluding out groups is even more important here, and that's why we're willing to stand by it. The next claim they talked about here is legal protection, which is very interesting because even in our contracts, there can be legal protection too. The problem here is they expect marriage to have some sort of special legal protection, which is precisely the problem. If a woman is raped, she should be protected regardless of whether she's married or not. And it's harmful to say that within marriage there are necessarily better protections against abuse and rape. And that informs their entire worldview that somehow one kind of relationship is special and the state can seek to make it special. The last thing they say is idea of encode. This idea of how there's impermanence for children, of how you could have a new dad and a new mom, and that's weird, right? That's it, right? And we agree. If people think that permanence is necessarily a good way of life and good for their children, they can do it under our world as well. They can stay together either with the temporary contracts or without the temporary contracts. I've given you the example of gay couples in countries where gay marriage is banned who have stayed together for 40 years. That is still entirely possible. But in their world, they exclude other modes through which children can also be brought up that are equally valuable as well, like platonic friendships, like old ideas of extended family, where you don't necessarily need a man and a woman who are married to bring a child up. And they cannot possibly say that these other arrangements are guaranteed to be bad for the child. So they have never proved why alternative arrangements are necessarily bad. At the end of the day, we stand for the idea that if marriage had not existed, society would be a lot less regressive, out groups will not feel as excluded, and after that, will be able to lead a life.